Welcome to the Propertybuyer Podcast. Join me, Rich Harvey, multi-award-winning buyers advocate and CEO of Propertybuyer, where we explore the world of real estate and help you make informed decisions about buying or investing in residential and commercial property. Our show features expert interviews, market insights, and practical tips for navigating the complex world of real estate. Whether you're a first-home buyer, a seasoned investor, or simply curious about the property market, our podcast is for you. Join us as we share our knowledge and experience and help you achieve your property goals. Well, welcome to another edition of the Propertybuyer Podcast. I'm Rich Harvey, CEO and founder. Today we're going to be talking rent versus buy. Now, rents have shot through the roof during 2022, rising over 10% nationally, and rents look set to continue at pace during 2023, adding to cost of living pressures. The level of rental stress is becoming more apparent each week as more migrants, international students and others arrive on our shores. Vacancy rates are also plummeting, making finding a suitable place to rent a real challenge. Mortgage stress is becoming a major issue for highly leveraged borrowers. Building approvals are declining and construction costs remain high. So the question arises, are you better off to rent or buy? To discuss this perennial question, we have a special guest with us today with exceptional financial skills, Peter Switzer, founder of Switzer Financial Group, to share his insights with us today. Welcome, Peter.
Yeah, hi, Rich.
Great to have you with us. Now, we have a little tradition with our podcast. Before we start, we have a thought of the week. And this week, we've got it from Mr. Albert Einstein, who says, strive not to be a success, but rather to be of value. What do you take away from that?
Well, I think that's a really good piece of advice. He also is famous for saying, if you keep doing the same things and expect to get a different result, it's a definition of insanity as well. And I think a lot of people when it comes to investing, are often ignoring that advice and are quite insane. But the reason is, I don't think people actually see themselves as investors when they put their money or borrow for really big assets. And so let's hope we are of value to the people who listen to us today.
Well, absolutely. I'm sure you've got some great pearls of wisdom to share with us. So maybe just to kick things off, I mentioned about mortgage stress in the introduction. Do you have a particular definition of what that looks like in today's world?
I don't really. I always take the kind of survey work that's done by guys like Martin North and people like that. And that's what Martin does. He's a statistics man, and at various stages, the mortgage stress numbers he's come out really are worrying for the groups in question. But I don't know if it really ever results in anything you can take away from it to make money out of. I guess if mortgage stress was at a really high level, you would expect eventually those people would be sellers, they would add to the supply and prices will go down. But as you know, this market's really complicated. When those sort of things happen, you often find that the demand changes at the same time. So you don't necessarily get the kind of results you want to get. So, But look, when interest rates rise, mortgage stress follows. And generally speaking, house prices will fall. But the magnitude of house price falls, as you would have noticed being in the property buying market in Sydney for at least
22 years now.
Yeah, I would have thought that. You were pretty young when I first met you. And that 22 years is really important because I can't remember the precise date, but around 2010, Sydney prices went sideways for a long time, didn't they?
Correct.
Before the takeoff.
That's right. I mean, that's what happens with Sydney. We tend to get these periods of gradual or very little growth and then rapid spikes, you know. But this question of mortgage stress, the official definition is where you're spending more than 30% of your pre-tax income on household loan repayments. But I think, obviously a lot of people in Sydney are now spending, 40 to 45%.
They go in with mortgage stress.
Exactly. They're going to go in. If they want to buy in the world-class city, that's what they've got to spend. I think that's just a factor of life. I mean, an interesting article in today's Fin Review was saying that the time taken to save for a deposit has been reduced by 8 months, but now it's taking longer to pay off that total home loan.
And I think it always gets down to this, and it varies from household to household. It should always be your ability to service the debt.
Correct.
And so some people are not average people in the sense that they are really high income earners, or they're prepared to work double income. They work a second job. They might put a side hustle, which I hate that term. It's very American. We used to call it a part-time business, didn't we? Yeah. But I think there's all those sorts of definitions. And I think the bottom line is, I think there's only a small number of people who, as a consequence of mortgage stress, lose their home. And I think bank statistics actually show that.
Well, that's the thing. Everyone's expecting at the moment there'd be a lot of forced sales coming on the market. I get rung up by journos all the time saying, Rich, are you seeing evidence of distress selling? Yeah. I'm not seeing any evidence of really distress selling. I am talking to agents who are talking to owners at the moment about what's my house worth, how much has it gone down by if I were to sell it, because they're getting a little bit squeezed. And when everybody comes off the fixed rate, that's when we'll see the major pain of all of these 10 successive rises come forward. So, but I think there's a bit of motivated selling, but I'm not seeing widespread distress selling.
No, and I think Sydney-siders in particular, who I know better than, I guess, other cities, I do know plenty of people in Melbourne as well, I think they would sell their grandmother into captivity before they sold their house. And also, mate, the statistic I've noticed recently, and you might have come across it as well, refinancing is really, really high. And the refinancers are actually doing it at compassionate rates. I believe CBA's even, in a sense, losing on the deals they're putting out now. They'll make money in the long run, but in the short term they might be, paying out more in terms of deposits and borrowing overseas to cover a loan. Yeah. So I think the cliff will be there for some people. It might not be as steep as we thought.
Exactly, I think so too. So another question for you, Peter, is we're talking about rental stress. We've got rents go up on average 10%, really in a lot of Sydney and Melbourne areas probably going up 15%. Yeah. What does rental stress look like for the average household?
Yeah, I think it's when you, well, obviously that 30% number we use for mortgages, that's relevant, but a lot of people are paying a lot more than that. I think rental stress is interesting to me because I think it is a real trigger for people to think about buying a place. It's a trigger for people to think, well, do I really have to live where I want to live? Maybe I need to go out a bit further and all that sort of stuff. So it's probably the great motivator for that ripple effect. I can remember, and you'd remember John McGrath at his peak when that business was really ballooning, and just about every real estate agent in the country was going to John McGrath lectures and all that sort of stuff. He always said that best place to buy is like the rings, the 4 or 5 kilometre ring around the CBD, then you go to the 10, and eventually it ripples out to the outer areas. And I actually remember when I was working on Mix 106.5 with Mike Carlton, when he was doing breakfast at the time, and all the inner city places, the prices were going through the roof, but where Mike lived out near Gordon or whatever, they weren't moving much at all, but eventually it has happened. It's expensive. The ripple effect, the people who, the trendies who had to live around the eastern suburbs or the Sydney University areas, Newtown, they realised they couldn't buy there anymore, so they went looking afield, and it rippled right out. In Blacktown, Blacktown average prices are over $1 million. That's the ripple effect. I think rental stress encourages people to look afield.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think definitely a lot of people are doing that equation in their head going, look, if my landlord's put up my rent by $150, $200 a week, and gosh, my interest only or my P&I repayments are going to be $150, it's almost equivalent. Why don't I get an asset and get into the housing market, get a foot on the property ladder and start making that jump to build equity?
And it's, our family would have said it's dead money rent. When people like us were encouraged by our parents to try and buy property, but also the smarter younger generations of recent times have actually thought, well, I'll rent where I want to live, but I'll own something and I'll be a landlord, and it kind of has dissipated the cost impulse of rental stress.
Well, that's the rent vesting technique, which we certainly encourage a lot of clients to do. If they can't afford to buy a $2.5 million home in Sydney or Melbourne, then think about buying something more affordable area. Perhaps it's going to be out of Melbourne or Newcastle or Brisbane.
Or a place like Albury, that's gone through the roof.
Or regional area, exactly, and have some foot in the market. But I think for people that, what do you say to people that go, you know what, I'm just going to rent and I'm going to put my money into other investments? Do you think that strategy can work as well?
It definitely can.
But what sort of financial intelligence do you need to have? You know, for me,
A real lot.
That's the thing. I think for me, it's like property is a great type of forced saving. It teaches you financial discipline because you've got to meet those mortgage repayments.
It's a great set and forget investment. And the beauty of property is, unlike the stock market, and you know I love the stock market, but the stock market is in your face every day because of people like me. The poor people on 2GB, you get up and hear what I tell them what's going on in the market. They got the pain or the happiness every day when financial commentators tell people what's going on. But if you own a house, you often don't know that prices in your areas have gone down. Sure, Domain and the REA publications are telling people on a much more regular basis, but still, I don't think you actually know what the value of your investment is unless you are in the business of selling or something like that. So, but I do believe, and I tell you what, one of the smartest guys in this country when it comes to assessing the value of assets was a guy called Phil Ribbon of Ibis World. You ever
yes,
come
I have. Yes,
yeah. Phil unfortunately passed away recently. And Phil was in the early 2000s was a great supporter of the idea of renting and investing in the stock market. And the reason is, as long as you invest in the right kinds of products, you can actually do as well in the stock market as you can. And I actually wrote up a piece as a consequence of this. And I've always been an investor in property, even though I love the stock market. And we invested in our early days in a suburb that was pretty well on the outer called Paddington. And when we
hasn't that come of age?
That's right. When we were first place in Paddington, our father, my wife's father, came into the house. He looked at what we bought. It was a working man's cottage. In fact, it was the builders of Victoria Barracks. Those bricklayers lived in these cottages. Wow. Yeah, and we bought that for $54,000, and but my father-in-law came in and said to his daughter, he said, "Oh, you made a big mistake. You better sell this as soon as you can." Fortunately, he was an engineer who just retired, so I used to start jobs I had no qualifications to finish, and he would come over on a Monday and say, "What's he done now?" And he would finish it off. In the end, we made a lot of money by being in an unwanted suburb, and that was a ripple effect. You know, places like Double Bay were always very expensive, and even Waverley was more expensive than Paddington. And so we bought the suburb beside, and then Darlinghurst and Redfern, all those sort of places did really well. Exactly. And so, but I actually wrote a story one day comparing my first place in Paddington with buying CBA shares.
And what was the net result?
Very similar.
There you go.
And what I said was, what you can look at a quality share, a blue chip share is like a blue chip property. Yes. And you know, you got to adjust the renovations you do and all those sorts of things, and you know, relying on a stinking tenant that really makes your life hard. Yeah. But I think quality blue chip investments, whether it be property or stocks, is a good way to go. However, one stock is dangerous. You need a diversified group, and then I think that's a really good comparison with a good quality property.
Yeah, fantastic. Great advice, Peter. So just thinking about it, like rents, this whole rent versus buy thing, why do you think rents have shot up so much in the past year? What's driving this massive increase?
Yeah, well, this country has a chronic problem with the supply of property. Property developers are overtaxed, and like, everyone wants to hate a developer because they eventually make money, or they cruel somebody along the way. But the bottom line is they're the ones who are taking the risk with their capital to provide places where people can live. And I've seen plenty of studies have shown, and you have probably seen them as well, that it's approximately about 30% of whatever a developer charges somebody for a quarter acre block or an apartment is various taxes. Exactly. State, local, federal, whatever. Yep. And so the supply of houses is really low, and as a consequence, but the demand is really high because Australians are chronically committed to owning property. So I think, and no government has really tried to address it. They talk about it, but they never do. End result, property prices remain really high, rents remain really high, and particularly when you consider we lost about 500,000 foreign workers during the pandemic. About 200,000 have come back. A lot of them are students. Not all those students are workers. A lot of those students are from very wealthy families, I've been told by friends of mine who own these schools. But a lot of them do work in Chinese restaurants or coffee shops and stuff like that. And they're missing at the moment, but they're coming back. And the more they come back, the more the rents will rise.
You're absolutely right. I used to do a lot of presentations. I still do a lot of webinars these days, but I'd get one particular chart from the ANZ and it would show the undersupply versus oversupply of property in Australia. And we were always massively undersupplied up until about 2015. Then we started to bridge the gap. But we're still, again, going through this next phase because immigration has perhaps been turned back on heavily. And their cap's at 190,000 plus temporary visas plus students. So we're going to have 250 to 300,000 migrants arriving. Where are they going to live? This is the problem.
And Richard, I guess you watch this closer than I do, but that period where supply increased, I reckon that coincided with a splurge of apartment constructions.
Correct.
And then apartments had problems, didn't they, when some of them were pretty dodgy. And then the pandemic hit, so you can understand why the supply has really gone off the boil.
Well, exactly. But to your point about developers, we do a lot of feasibilities for our developers buying sites, and construction costs have gone up anywhere from 30 to 50% or more. And so to actually find a feasible site, to actually encourage a developer, to actually get money from a bank to actually do a development has to stack up. Otherwise developers, it just won't get built. And I think, unfortunately, we are going to see a lot of media headlines. I mean, there's got to be a stronger word for chronic. It's going to come. The next 12 months, we're going to see a lot of media about that particular issue. So, and actually, just to that point, I'll just give our listeners a bit of data on vacancy rates. And, the vacancy rates back in January for Sydney was 1.3%, still that same level now. Melbourne's currently at 1.1%, Brisbane's at 0.8%, Perth's at 0.4%, Adelaide 0.5%, Canberra 1.8%.
So what we're saying, looking at the total potential supply of rental properties, like in Brisbane, only 0.8% are available.
Correct. It's just such a small proportion. So no wonder you've got 20, 30 people or more putting in applications on each property. And you got the Greens like creating a stupid policy. Well, let's cap the rents. So I guess the question to you is what could be done to alleviate the rental crisis? Do you think there's any particular policy, and has the government got their head in the sand?
Well, obviously, thinking about the tax implications of constructing is a really important one. I don't think the old solutions of housing commission developments really work. I think they've got to encourage the private system. This is something that's big overseas, and this is what a lot of people are surprised about. In this country, landlords are mum and dad investors.
Correct.
They're often nurses and policemen and policewomen and all that sort of stuff. But in America, they're companies. And I think we're going to see that trend, the building to rent model. Now, obviously, Harry Triguboff has that kind of model, often by accident. And Harry will, I don't know if he'll admit it or not, but I have had a lunch with him and tried to get him to admit to it. But when he was young, like all developers, they're dependent on the banks. And so if the what hits the fan, they were in trouble. Interest rates were rising and all that sort of stuff. But he's got so big, he can lend himself money. And when the last downturn happened, that period we were talking about in Sydney when prices were going nowhere, he built a lot of his Meriton properties. He turned them into rents.
Exactly.
He rented them.
Just hang on to them.
That's right. And
get the cash flow.
I think that model has been seen to work. Because look at the enormous growth around the Moore Park Supercentre and all that area. That's an entire suburb that's been created. And I think that's going to be the way to go. The problem then will be rents still will be pretty high. But I guess at the end of the day, if people want to live in the CBD of Sydney, it's one of the most sought after cities of the world. And Melbourne, of course, is the most livable city, if you believe the Melbourneites and the people outside who say that. You're just simply going to have to pay.
It is. Well, I think the build to rent model is absolutely here. I know Mirvac and Frasers and other larger developers are absolutely looking at it, and the economics are becoming better because what they're doing in these developments is creating like an internal community. They're putting in a movie theatre, recreation areas, community rooms, libraries, gym facilities. So you've got a little ecosystem within these rent to buy, and they even have concierge services for people to collect your mail and do that sort of thing.
It's like a Seinfeld episode.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think there's another theme that explains this as well. When you and I were young, the most we were losing from our super was 3%. There was even no super when I first started, you know. So I was getting all my money, and so it was easy for me to take my money, get a deposit and buy a home. Younger people now are losing 10.5 and will eventually lose 12%. And so therefore, the rents are going to have to be reflecting the fact that people are losing, being taxed for their retirement, 12%.
You're right, yeah. I think the other thing about the government policy response is, I know particularly in the New South Wales legislation, is they need to legislate for quicker planning and especially for medium density. Like a lot of the suburban, the middle and outer ring suburbs, where there's just 98% houses and only 2% units or townhouses. People are aging in place in their homes, and they want to move, but there's no option. They want to stay close to their family and their social network, but there's nowhere to move. So instead of thinking about in their 60s and 70s moving out of the home to let the younger generation come in, they just keep staying there till they're 80 or 90 or till they die. And so that's locking up the housing market. So what they need to have is better legislation to have. It was called the Manor House legislation, and they introduced it, but then it got knocked on the head because the councils didn't want to do it because it was a complying development. But that sort of policy is a smart policy to have sort of medium density, not high density, in the suburbs, But everyone's got the NIMBY, not in my backyard approach, and they just don't want to have development.
Tell me, Rich, friends of ours left their home in Blackheath and moved down to Berry into a complex of people who were retirees. It was owned by Macquarie. Macquarie owned it, and there was basically a whole series of townhouses, and with the swimming pool, a common area, a gym, and all that sort of stuff. That seems to me a really good model to help those older people. But I guess, in their case, they were lucky. Their family lived down the south coast. Your model is it should be in the areas where older people are, where they want to stay.
Exactly.
There's probably at the moment groups like Macquarie will be looking at salubrious areas to attract people. And of course,
well, some people just do want a sea change or a tree change, and they want to move out of the burbs into those areas or closer to the beach or south coast, north coast. So there can be those areas there. But I'd like to just go back a little step, if I may, and just sort of delve into your calculator brain and just ask you what goes into sort of the calculation of whether you should rent or buy. How does the average person out there think about the decision to rent or buy?
Yeah, I think people get caught between the short term and the long term. In their more enlightened moments, they think long term. What do I have to sacrifice now to one day have a home that's going to be really valuable? It might be something that ultimately I can downsize when I retire. But young people never think about retiring. They think about capital gain. They also think about creeping from suburb to suburb to suburb, up. What's the term you use for that? It's not upvaluing.
Downsizing? You mean upsizing?
Well, yeah, upsizing. Yeah. So and I think younger people are committed to that kind of thing. But and the decision to move from renting to buying is often driven by interest rates, what's happening in the income for the household, and also the cost of childcare. Yeah. There's so many equations that go into it, but. Look, I think one of the biggest problems for younger people who aren't heading in the right direction is that they aren't planning. You know the old saying. If you're going to plan, don't plan to fail. Fail to plan. And plan to fail. Yeah. What is that old saying?
A lot of people.
I haven't used it for a long time ago.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that if you don't plan, ultimately you'll fail.
Correct.
And so people should be being really objective, seeing themselves like an entity, an entity that wants something, and that would be to be economically better off in 5 or 10 or 15 years. And they should be looking at the best way of doing that. And when you write something down, I always say start with a budget to really know where you are spending money. And then I say once you know where you're spending money, try and GST your life. Hit it with a 10% slug across all your spending, and all of a sudden you've found a saving amount, which you can either invest or you use to grow your savings to get a deposit. I think people don't do this cost-benefit analysis, and as a consequence, they're stuck in a high rent situation. How many people are living in high rental areas and as a consequence, not saving enough to move to another area.
Exactly.
And when you put a plan down, that's when you start asking the objective questions.
Yeah.
Do I have to live
Yes.
here?
Yeah.
Can I save more? What do I need to get? Also, where can I get cheaper money? Like, people go to their bank and don't even go to 2 or 3 mortgage brokers to see if there's some good deals out there. And I remember when we were doing a very big development in one of the places, and I'd never in my life, and this is probably late 1990s or early 2000s, I'd never thought about borrowing interest only. And interest only was a fantastic way for us to get the loan, have the cash flow, and ultimately we sold that place for a record in that area.
Perfect.
You know, we had made a decision, we loved the place, but we knew we could make a lot of money out of it. That was a rational decision that came from planning, asking questions, talking to mortgage brokers.
Yeah, brilliant. So what I'm hearing you say, to work out this calculation, it's about setting a goal, it's about having a plan, it's being disciplined, being forward-looking, and getting a budget, and literally just monitoring the numbers, because if you don't have a plan, then you're going to fail. At the
That's
end of
right,
the day.
and also talk to people who are experienced in this area. And so mortgage brokers at that point in time knew a lot more about the loans out there than I did. I can remember when Peter Higgins came over from Western Australia to Sydney with a little business called Mortgage Choice. And he had a laptop, and on that laptop there were 13 lenders. And he actually showed me in the office he had in Ultimo, and I'd never seen anything like that. No one had in Sydney. They were the first guys to bring it over. Brilliant. And that was an extraordinary experience to see that there were 13 different lenders with all different rates. And I think that's what people need to do. They need to be pursuing the information that gives them the competitive advantage to eventually purchase wisely, or even rent wisely. Because if you rent wisely, you can save better.
Yeah. So let's just look at the quick summary of the pros and cons of renting versus buying. What do you think is the upside of renting and the downside, and then also the upside and downside of buying?
Okay. Well, I think the only upside of renting is that you live in an area where you want to live. It may well provide you with the scope to invest in other things. And as I say, like, if Rich, we know there are great suburbs in Sydney that have fantastic per annum rises in price, but we know there are a lot of suburbs that have really small ones. And there are plenty of suburbs that maybe only go up 4 or 5% per annum, right?
Yep.
Well, I can guarantee you, I can give you an investment strategy that will be 7 or 8% per annum. So if you are not, so renting in an area that provides you with the ability to get 7 or 8% per annum in other investments means that that's probably a better thing to do. But if you're wise enough to move in, be able to access those suburbs with 10 or 11 or 12% per annum, well, then that's a better thing. And I think that all comes around by becoming more savvy about investing. And I think that renting is a part of that story.
I think on the other side of the financial benefit, there's also the psychological benefit of having your piece of Australia, a place you call home. And, you can do with the place what you want to. If you're a tenant, you kind of, I can't change the carpet. And yes, you might be able to change the walls, but you've got to paint them back again. So having that own sort of safety of a place to call home is, I think, a huge benefit for people.
And there's another thing I'd throw in as well. And you probably know this better than me, but my suspicion is rents seldom fall. I know during bad times they can, like during pandemic, the inner city apartments prices, because all the students, all the foreign people are gone. But interest rates fall a lot faster and more regularly than rents.
Yes.
And so sometimes, the short-term pain of being in a high interest rate situation can then bring relief when interest rates fall. Yeah. But your rents are more likely to stay where they are if you're in a really good area. There's big demand.
That's a good point. I mean, I think at the moment we're going through this rapid period of interest rate rises, and the mortgage rate's at like 5.5, maybe 5.75. It'll probably come back next year. I think we'll see 1, 2, maybe 3 cuts next year, and we'll probably see a mortgage rate settle at around 5%, which is what it's been historically for a long period of time.
And Rich, I think a lot of people who are turning up to auctions right now probably heard Bill Evans say there could be 7 interest rate cuts over 24, 25. Now, 7 interest rate cuts would make people think, well, I'll borrow now, I'll gamble that Bill's right. But people are like that. They love property so much, they would do that.
And Bill's pretty accurate, I've got to say. He's not bad.
Yeah, he's had a good history.
Yeah. So just, I guess another question is, how do you save for a deposit? I know when I bought my first home, my wife and I had saved a lot we squirreled away some money. And we'd saved 50,000, I think, each for a deposit, and got our 100 grand to our first property. But it was hard.
It was lousy property.
It was hard work.
No,
it was hard work back in the day. So,
yeah, it was.
Yeah.
But look, I think what I said earlier. In fact, I wrote this today on Switzer Daily, that the starting point to increase your savings has to be, well, obviously the super options are very good. There's non-concessional contributions you can make and you can withdraw. I hope Labor doesn't change that. So using your super to build up a deposit is a really good idea. But also, I think if you just put your money in a term deposit earning 4%, it's going to be very hard. And so I would be inclined to look at like an exchange traded fund. And this is not advice, this is education here. But an exchange traded fund can give you access to the ASX 200 index, okay? The ticker codes are IOZ, STW, A200, they're all, now, the ASX 200 averages a 10% rise over a 10-year period. So the year you go in, you might lose 25%. But if you were planning to save over a 10-year period, you look at the history of the ASX 200, it gains about that. And half of that is dividends. So the volatility of the stock market can sometimes mask the fact that a good ETF can give you like a 4 or 5%, plus there's franking credits as well. So I think people need to, in this crazy world where they've been deprived of 10% of their money because of compulsory super, where term deposits are really low. My argument was stronger when term deposits are only 1%, 4% is better. But I think they're going to have to come up with some kind of strategy. And that's what I talked about. An ETF for the ASX 200 means you're betting on the companies of Australia, the best 200 listed companies. So it's risky, but not as risky as a lot of people would think. And as long as you believe, understand, you could lose some years, but 7 years out of 10, the market goes up.
Okay. You mean you can't just stick your money in the bank and, as you say, in a cash deposit? It's not going to get you towards your goal.
No, it's not.
You've got to have an inflation-beating strategy and invest that money wisely
I guess you'll come across the rule of 72, but I'll remind you of it. If someone gets an 8% return, your money doubles every 9 years. So if someone drew some money out of super, built up super first, drew some money out, and then maybe went for something like, as I say, you could lose in the short term, but history says in the long term you would benefit.
And even another strategy we're seeing some of our clients do is rent vesting, and they're buying an investment property. I mean, every day of the week we can go and buy a property for that client, get a 5% yield. Typically it's going to grow at least 6 to 7% in the areas that we're choosing. So you're looking at 11 to 12% return on your money. And that's a way, and some people are buying multiple properties like that. We've got 3 or 4 clients buying 3 or 4 properties each. And then they'll hold that for sort of 5, maybe 10 years. Then they might decide to sell it down or just withdraw the equity and then use that to get into their capital city where they want to end up living.
What we're talking about is normal people have to look for abnormal strategies to beat the system.
That's
unfortunate, but it never really was easy. You borrowed from parents and the parents gave you a hard time or whatever, but it's certainly harder now than it was.
Is there any other strategies to help our listeners avoid mortgage stress? How can people sort of manage their money at the moment?
Look, most people live their life in money chaos. They think, my wage is coming in, I have this sort of spending, eureka, that's what I've saved. And I think you really have to become strategic about a really important subject called money. And, reading books like The Richest Man in Babylon is where I get the idea of GST in your life. If for example you're spending $70,000 a year and you can cut your spending by 10%, all of a sudden there's $7,000 coming out that you didn't know was there.
Yes.
Or you're giving away to other people. And it might mean you can't drink Asahi beer, you have to drink VB or whatever. Or maybe make your own.
Yeah.
Making your own is better than the crap young stuff they're making now. Have you noticed that all these boutique beers they're making?
Lots of breweries around.
It just tastes like my dad's homemade Cooper's. He used to buy Cooper's stuff and in a plastic bin. And I used to drink it with him, and I humoured him, but Crown Lager always tasted better.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep, perfect. And look, got two more questions before we come into land. I'd love to hear your favourite property story, and then finally your best piece of investment advice. But tell us, have you got a favourite property story you'd like to share?
Well, my favourite property story was the one about my father-in-law, who just could not believe it that we would go into such a place that needed to be renovated. And he's a great guy who eventually passed away close to 90. Yeah. But when he was on his deathbed, we'd sold that place we bought for $54 for about $800,000, and he was really happy about that. And I think that's the important lesson, is that, look, the best analogy, the best piece of advice I've got is always look for the worst house in the best street. That's a great piece of property advice. Recognise that it's a long-term investment. Always buy when everyone is scared. That's the time to, and always sell when everyone wants to buy. I think those kinds of stories.
The counter-cyclical approach always works. Well, I can tell you myself, I've done that, particularly during the GFC.
You're in the industry.
I bought multiple properties in the last couple of years, and particularly during the GFC, I bought several properties in that time. It was the best time to buy when there's peak panic. And everyone's looking the other way, and people don't look long-term. They've got to consider interest rates. They're thinking interest rates will stay so high. Well, they're not. They're just there a high to get inflation under control. It will come back. It'll be a more normalised market. And I think we've just got to, I guess my advice would be for listeners to set a plan, get a budget, get the right kind of advisors around you that know and walk their talk, and get an action plan and get into the market, build that equity, and get on your way into the Australian property market.
I would sensibly read me every day on Switzer daily, because this is what I try to do. I actually try and look at in particular, I look at what my colleagues in the media are using as headlines, which invariably is scaring the pants off people. And when the market crashed with the pandemic, that was the best buying opportunity in recent times. And I know in our case we had sold one of our businesses, and my wife, who's not really an experienced investor, though she edits the Switzer report, so she was getting to read what I read, and Paul Rickard and our other really highly enlightened analysts. And Maureen bought so many great stocks. She's averaged something like 30% return per annum since, by purely taking the advice of people with insight and having the courage to buy. As Warren Buffett said, be fearful when others are greedy, and be greedy when others are fearful. I think it works in the stock market, and it works in property.
Absolutely works in property. And Peter, if people would like to get more information about your services and your blogs, etc., where can they find that?
So every day, switzer.com.au, and if they want really tailored investment advice, go to switzerreport.com.au. That's just for subscribers, and we send out 3 newsletters a week. We do a few webinars, and people get to hear the insights of really successful traders.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate your insights today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for listening. I'm Rich Harvey for the Propertybuyer Podcast. We look forward to joining you again on another great episode very soon. Bye for now. Well, thanks for being with us on the Propertybuyer Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions or would like further information about buying property, please visit propertybuyer.com.au, and we'd be delighted to help. We have loads of free resources and market updates and recent articles for you to explore. We look forward to joining you on another episode very soon. I'm Rich Harvey. Thanks for listening.